The German Shepherd hit the floor in a fighting stance the moment the trauma doors blew open, and not one of the four doctors rushing in could get within 3 feet of the unconscious woman on the gurney. The dog planted itself, 85 pounds of muscle and teeth, and growled at every white coat in the room. Security was already on their radios. Dr. Marcus Vale was already shouting. The whole trauma bay had frozen in the kind of stunned silence that only happens when something ancient and instinctual cuts through all the noise. Then the dog turned, looked across the room, found the one person standing quietly near the supply cart, and stepped aside. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories that stop you cold live. Stories about the people nobody sees coming. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that trauma bay in Harlow, because what happened next changed everything. The night shift at Cascade Valley Medical Center started the way most nights did in Harlow, Oregon, with a broken coffee machine in the break room, a waiting area stacked 3 deep with people who'd been sitting there since lunch, and the particular low-grade chaos that came from being a level 2 trauma center in a mid-sized city that didn't have the budget to be one. Nurse Sarah Elon had been at Cascade Valley for 6 years. She knew the rhythms of the place the way you know a house you've lived in long enough, where the floors creaked, which supply cabinet stuck, which attending would listen, and which ones would cut you off mid-sentence. She'd learned to read the building like weather, and tonight the building felt wrong. She noticed it around 11:15. A stillness that didn't match the noise, the kind of thing you couldn't name but couldn't ignore once you'd felt it. She was restocking the suture cart near Bay 4 when the radio crackle from the ambulance bay came through the intercom. 43-year-old female, blunt force trauma, unconscious, unstable, estimated arrival 90 seconds. Standard enough. Cascade Valley saw trauma cases 3-4 times a week. What wasn't on the radio was the dog. Sarah heard it before she saw it. A low, continuous sound that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a growl, something that sat in the space between warning and rage. She stepped out into the main corridor just as the ambulance bay doors slammed open, and 2 paramedics fought to keep a gurney moving while a German Shepherd walked alongside it with the kind of deliberate calm that was somehow more frightening than hysteria. The dog wasn't restrained. There was no leash, no handler, no muzzle. It simply moved with the gurney as though it had decided this was its job and dared anyone to argue. "Where's animal control?" someone barked from the nurse's station. Called. 8 minutes out. "We can't have a dog in trauma." "Tell the dog that." Dr. Marcus Vale came out of the attending office, still pulling on his coat, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and stopped when he saw the animal. He was Cascade Valley's senior trauma attending, mid-50s, broad-shouldered, the kind of doctor who filled a room and expected the room to adjust. He'd been in medicine for 28 years. He'd seen plenty of things in trauma bays. He hadn't seen this. "Get it out of here," he said, not raising his voice because he didn't need to. His resident, Dr. Priya Sandoval, and 2 nurses from the night team moved toward the gurney. The dog's growl shifted register, deeper, deliberate, a sound like a locked door. Everyone stopped. The paramedic at the head of the gurney, a stocky man named Dave Riordan, who'd been running calls in Harlow for 11 years, kept his eyes on the dog as he spoke. "She was found in a vehicle off Route 9, driver's side. Vehicle had rolled. Dog was in the back seat. It wouldn't leave her. We couldn't make it leave her." "Is it hers?" Sandoval asked. "No tags we could find except—" Riordan hesitated. "Military tag on the patient's wrist. We didn't get to run it. The dog kept moving every time we tried." Vale took a breath. He was not a man given to hesitation, but something about the way the animal was positioned, between the woman on the gurney and every physician in the room, made him careful. "We need to assess the patient," he said, stepping forward. The shepherd moved with him, matched his step. The growl came again, low and certain. Sarah watched from the edge of the bay. She'd pressed herself against the supply cart when everyone else had surged forward, and now she stood still, watching the dog, not the patient. Watching the way the animal's eyes moved, the way it was oriented, not just positioned between the woman and the doctors, but specifically tracking each person who stepped closer. It wasn't panic, it wasn't random aggression, it was targeted. She knew this behavior. She knew it the way you know something you were trained to recognize and then spent years trying not to think about. The dog was screaming. "Dr. Vale," she said. He didn't look at her. "Dr. Vale, I think. Bennett, not now." He turned to the charge nurse. "I need someone to get animal control here faster, and I need this dog secured so we can do our jobs." Sarah Elon, who had not been Sarah Bennett since the day she filled out her application at Cascade Valley 6 years ago, closed her mouth. Watched the dog. Watched the woman on the gurney, who was pale and still and had blood matted in her hair above her left ear. The patient's wrist was angled just enough that Sarah could see it. A thin metal tag, the kind issued by a very specific branch of the U.S. military, the kind she had worn herself. She looked away before anyone could see where her eyes had gone. Vale tried again to approach. The dog moved. Not aggressive, not lunging, but a single deliberate step that placed its body squarely between the physician and the gurney. "For the love of—" Vale stopped, looked around the room. "Does anyone have a relationship with this animal? Riordan, did you interact with it at the scene?" "It wouldn't come near any of us," Riordan said. "Kept circling the vehicle. When we got the woman out, it just followed." Vale looked at the trauma team. The resident. The nurses. Security had arrived at the bay door, 2 of them, hands spread in the universal posture of people who did not want to get bitten. The dog stood in the center of the bay. It turned its head slowly, methodically, around the room. And then it stopped. It was looking at Sarah. She felt the animal's attention the way you feel something that happens in the body before the mind catches up. A shift of weight, a change in pressure. The shepherd held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then it took 2 steps to the left. A single, precise movement, creating a path between itself and the gurney. A path that led to the patient. The room noticed. She saw Sandoval's head turn, saw Riordan's eyebrows go up, saw Vale look from the dog to Sarah and back again with an expression that moved between irritation and something he wasn't going to name. "Elan," he said. "Go ahead." It wasn't an invitation. It was an experiment. Sarah moved. The dog watched her approach without moving, without sound. She stepped to the side of the gurney and placed 2 fingers on the patient's wrist. Pulse, fast and thready, not catastrophic yet, but wrong, and looked at the woman's face. Late 30s, possibly 40, with the kind of fitness that spoke of deliberate maintenance rather than casual luck. There was bruising along the jaw and a laceration above the left temple, and the blood in her hair had soaked through the emergency bandage the paramedics had applied. The dog settled. Not completely. The muscles along its back were still tight, the eyes still moving, but the growl stopped. "She's bradycardic," Sarah said. "Pulse is around 52. Respirations are shallow. We need a head CT, and we need it before—" "I'm aware of the protocol, Elon." Vale had stepped up beside her, and his voice had the particular flatness that meant he was managing his temper. He did a 30-second assessment. Pupils, airway, the obvious injuries. "Sandoval, get the bay set up. I want a full panel, cross-type and screen, and get neuro on the phone." He looked at Sarah briefly. "Good. Step back." She stepped back. The dog allowed Vale to approach now, though it kept its position near the head of the gurney in a way that felt less like submission and more like supervision. The next 12 minutes were controlled chaos, the kind that Cascade Valley did well when Vale was running it. Lines went in, blood was drawn, the tech from radiology appeared with the portable unit. Sandoval rattled off vitals, and Vale directed the response with the efficiency of someone who'd done this enough times that it had become physical memory. Sarah restocked the cart, handed equipment when asked, did what nurses on the night shift did when an attending had taken command of a situation, moved around the edges of it, kept the system running, stayed out of the way. At 12:40 in the morning, someone wheeled in the IV setup. Sarah was at the medication cabinet when she saw it. The setup itself was unremarkable. A standard fluid line, a secondary port for medication delivery, the kind of configuration she'd primed 100 times. The dosage on the bag was correct. The rate looked right. Nothing about it would have stopped anyone. But the secondary line had a particular quality to the way it was clamped, a specific angle on the port cap that she'd only ever seen in one context. Field assembly. Fast setup under pressure, when you were working without full supplies and cutting corners that weren't quite corners. She stood at the cabinet and looked at the line for 4 seconds. 5. reminded herself that she was a night shift nurse at a mid-level trauma center in Harlow, Oregon, and that she had walked away from the thing that made her recognize field assembly techniques, and that walking away had been the right decision. She carried the saline flushes to the bay. "Elan, I know." She handed Sandoval what she needed before the resident finished the sentence. Sandoval gave her a brief, startled look, the look junior doctors sometimes gave when a nurse anticipated them, and didn't say anything. The medication was prepped and ready to run. Vale checked it, initialed the chart, gave the order. Sarah looked at the line, looked at the port, looked at the secondary bag, hanging slightly higher than standard position, the tubing running at the particular angle that meant whoever had set it up had been trained to do it differently. She thought about the military tag on the patient's wrist. She thought about the dog, which was now sitting beside the gurney with its eyes on the medication stand. "Wait," she said. Vale was already moving on to the next order. "What?" "Wait on the IV push." She kept her voice even. "Something's off with the secondary line." He stopped, looked at her. His expression was the particular combination of professional patience and genuine irritation that she'd cataloged over 6 years of working in the same building. "Off how?" "The port setup, the angle of the secondary. It's a standard configuration." "It's not exactly standard." She heard herself saying it and knew how it sounded. She was a floor nurse questioning a senior attending's medication order in the middle of a trauma assessment at 12:40 in the morning. She had no specific evidence. She had a feeling rooted in training she wasn't supposed to have. "The medication was checked and initialed," Vale said. "The dosage is correct. I checked it myself." "I know. I'm not saying the dosage is wrong. I'm saying the line." He looked at her for a moment. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when someone says something that doesn't fit. Sandoval was watching. The tech was watching. Even the dog had shifted its attention. "Elan." Vale's voice dropped. "Careful. Like talking to someone who might be having a problem. You're looking at a standard trauma IV setup. I need you to step back and let us work. Just give me 30 seconds to check the secondary port." "We don't have 30 seconds to waste on..." "Then give me 10. She kept her eyes on him. "If I'm wrong, it costs us 10 seconds. If I'm right, it costs her everything." The room held. Vale's jaw tightened. He was not a man who backed down, and he was not a man who liked being contradicted in his own trauma bay by a nurse who'd been on the floor for 6 years without doing anything to distinguish herself from the 40 other nurses in the building. He had 30 seconds worth of reasons to dismiss her and move on. He looked at the dog. The shepherd was watching the medication stand with the same deliberate attention it had used to clear a path through the room. 10 seconds, Vale said. Sarah moved to the line. She kept her movements slow, methodical, checked the port cap, traced the tubing from the secondary bag down to the junction point. There, at the junction, where the secondary port met the primary line, there was a microfracture in the port housing. Small enough to miss. Small enough that the pressure differential between the two bags would cause the secondary to backflush at a rate that was not on any order and not in any documentation. She didn't pull the line yet. She looked at it for 2 full seconds, confirming. Then she disconnected the secondary. The dog exhaled. A long, slow breath. "What did you find?" Sandoval asked. Sarah turned the secondary port cap over in her fingers. "Port's compromised. Microfracture at the junction. The secondary would have backflushed into the primary line at an uncontrolled rate." She kept her voice clinical, gave Vale the information without the surrounding architecture of what she thought it meant. "I need to swap out the line and run the secondary bag separately before we run anything." Vale took the port cap from her, examined it. His expression shifted, one of those controlled shifts that experienced physicians make when they're recalibrating without wanting anyone to see them do it. "Swap it out," he said quietly. She did. New line, new port, properly configured. The medication ran cleanly. She logged the equipment failure and flagged the discarded line for lab review. Protocol. The kind of protocol that didn't mean much in the moment, but created a paper trail. Nobody said anything more about it. The trauma assessment continued. The patient was moved to radiology for the head CT. The dog was eventually coaxed, not restrained, coaxed, with the specific patience of a security guard named Thomas, who turned out to have grown up with working dogs, into a side corridor with a bowl of water and a blanket from the supply closet. By 2 in the morning, the trauma bay had settled into the particular post-crisis quiet that felt like held breath. Sandoval was writing orders. Vale was on the phone with neurology. Sarah was finishing her supply restock. She was not thinking about the military tag. She was not thinking about the field assembly angle on the secondary line. She was not thinking about the fact that a compromised port wasn't a manufacturing defect she'd ever seen on a line that had been opened from a sealed package less than 20 minutes ago. She was thinking about exactly none of that when Vale came to stand beside the supply cart. "You've been here 6 years," he said. "Yes." "Before that?" She kept her hands moving, counting gauze packs. "Travel nursing. Before that, school." He was quiet for a moment. "That was a good catch." She nodded once, said nothing. "Where did you learn to look at IV setups like that?" "Experience," she said. "You see enough of them, you start to notice when something's off." He held her gaze for a beat. He was smart enough to know that was an incomplete answer, and experienced enough to know when pushing wouldn't get him more than he already had. "Get some rest when you can," he said, and walked away. Sarah finished the restock, wrote her incident report on the compromised port, filed it through the standard electronic system, the way you filed anything that was routine and unremarkable, the way you kept things from becoming questions. She was 3 sentences into the report when her charge nurse, Deanna Holt, appeared at her shoulder. "You've got a visitor." "At 2 in the morning?" "Police officer. Says it's about the patient in Bay 4. Deanna's voice was careful. "He's asking specifically for you." Sarah closed the incident report, saved it. Took 3 seconds longer than necessary to push back her chair. "Where is he?" "Family consultation room, room B." Deanna paused. "Sarah, he's not in Harlow PD uniform, he's—" She stopped. Started again. "He's Army." The corridor between the nurses' station and the family consultation rooms was 42 feet. Sarah had walked it hundreds of times. Tonight it felt like something she was crossing without a map, moving towards something on the other side that she'd spent 6 years making sure she'd never have to face again. She put her hand on the door of room B, pushed it open. The man inside was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, but she knew before she finished reading his face that Deanna had been right. She knew the way you know someone who's been shaped by the same things that shaped you. The posture, the stillness, the particular quality of attention that never fully turned off. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Sergeant Elon." Not a question. She hadn't been called that in 6 years. "You have the wrong person," she said. "No," he said, "I don't." He reached into his jacket and placed a photograph on the table between them. The patient from Bay 4, in uniform, younger but unmistakably the same woman. "The patient in your trauma bay is Major Ava Rourke. She's attached to a classified unit operating out of Fort Callum. She's been missing for 31 hours. He met Sarah's eyes. "And the reason she's still alive right now is that you were standing at that supply cart." Sarah didn't move. "We have the lab results from the port you flagged," he said. "They came back 40 minutes ago." She waited. "The secondary bag wasn't a pharmacy error," he said. "The medication in it wasn't what the label said." The room was very quiet. "Someone tampered with it," the man said, "before it ever left the pharmacy." Sarah looked at the photograph of Major Ava Rourke, standing in uniform with the particular straight-shouldered ease of someone who'd earned it. She looked at her own hands. The dog hadn't been protecting the Major from the accident. It had been protecting her from the hospital. The man's name was Warren Cahill. He told her that much before she could decide whether she wanted to know it. He was not technically military anymore. He said attaché when she asked what his role was, which was the kind of non-answer that people in his former line of work used when the actual answer involved clearance levels she no longer held. I was mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor operations rather than office fluorescence. And he had the specific quality of patience that came from spending years in environments where showing urgency got people killed. Sarah sat down across from him. Not because she wanted to, but because standing felt like it meant something and she hadn't decided yet what she meant. "How did you find me?" she asked. "You flagged the IV line. The flag triggered an alert." "That's not an answer." "The line went to a lab with a federal contract. The results flagged a watch list. The watch list is connected to Major Rourke's active case file." He folded his hands on the table. The system found you, not me. I just drove here. And you pulled my record? Yes. My civilian record. And the other one? He said it without apology. Sergeant Sarah Elon, attached to the 19th Medical Detachment out of Fort Callum. Separated from service 6 years ago, general discharge, no stated reason in the public-facing file. He paused. The stated reason is in a different file. She didn't respond to that. The stated reason was something she hadn't spoken out loud since the day she signed the separation paperwork. In a room not unlike this one, with a different man sitting across a different table with a different kind of patience. What do you need from me? She asked. What you saw, what you noticed. All of it, starting from the moment the gurney came through the doors. I already filed an incident report. The incident report says the port had a microfracture. It doesn't say why you were looking at it in the first place. She looked at the photograph of Ava Rourke, still face up on the table between them. The woman in the picture was standing in front of a vehicle she didn't recognize, in a landscape that could have been anywhere dry and high altitude. She looked like someone who had made a series of hard choices and had stopped second-guessing them. Sarah knew the type. She'd been the type once. The secondary line was assembled in a way I recognized, she said. Field configuration, fast setup, non-standard materials. You only learn to build a line like that if someone taught you under conditions where the standard materials weren't available. Go on. The angle of the port cap, the way the tubing was routed around the junction, small things. The kind of small things you learn when you've been working medical support in environments where the supply chain doesn't always show up. She paused. The port itself was compromised, microfracture at the junction where the secondary met the primary line. That's not a manufacturing defect. I've never seen that kind of fracture come out of a sealed package. Meaning someone opened the package and resealed it. Meaning someone with enough skill to make it look intact compromised the port and then resealed it well enough that a routine visual check would miss it. She kept her voice level. It would have passed Vale's check. It passed mine the first time. I had to look twice. Cahill nodded slowly. The lab confirmed a compound in the secondary bag that wasn't on the order. It's a cardiac suppressor, not lethal in small doses, but combined with the head trauma and Major Rourke's pre-existing condition, it would have caused a secondary cardiac event within 40 minutes of administration. It would have presented as a complication of the initial injury. Sarah was quiet for a moment. It would have looked like she died from the accident, she said. Yes. And no one would have questioned it. There was no reason to question it. Single vehicle accident on a rural highway, driver with head trauma, cardiac event during treatment. Happens. He said the last word with a flat, specific bitterness that told her it had happened before, in cases he'd worked, in ways that had not ended the way this one had. The dog was the only reason she wasn't alone when the vehicle went off the road. Rourke doesn't go anywhere without the animal. It's been with her unit for 4 years. What's the dog's name? Cahill looked slightly surprised by the question. Dax. She thought about Dax sitting in the corridor with a bowl of water, watching a blanket with the specific alertness of an animal that was not actually resting. He knew, she said, at the scene, at the hospital. He knew the threat hadn't ended. Working dogs pick up things we don't. Cahill leaned forward slightly. The question I need answered tonight is how the medication got into that hospital. Someone moved it through your pharmacy system. Someone who knew Rourke was coming in, or who had enough access to act quickly once she arrived. Sarah had been trying not to arrive at the same conclusion. She'd been trying since the moment she'd examined the port cap and understood what she was looking at. She'd been trying because the alternative, that someone inside Cascade Valley had done this, was the kind of thought that changed the texture of every room you walked into afterward. How long between when the ambulance call came in and when the medication was delivered to the bay? She asked. 22 minutes. That's not enough time to tamper with something from outside. The line was already in the pharmacy, already prepared. She stopped. Someone prepared it in advance. Yes. Which means either someone knew she was coming before the accident or someone was waiting for an opportunity. Cahill's voice was careful. Major Rourke's vehicle was run off the road. We know that from the tire marks and the damage pattern on the guardrail. This wasn't an accident. The consultation room felt smaller than it had when she walked in. Sarah looked at the table, at the space between her hands. She had a particular habit, left over from a previous life, of cataloging exits when she entered a room. She'd done it automatically when she pushed the door open. There were two, the one she'd come through and a service door at the back that connected to the staff corridor. She'd noted them both and hadn't thought about why until now. "What do you need from me specifically?" she asked again. "Right now, stay in the building. Talk to no one about what you saw or what we've discussed. When my team arrives, about 40 minutes, I'll need you to walk them through the physical setup of the pharmacy and the trauma bay." "Your team?" "I'm not here alone. I'm the advance." She absorbed that. "And Major Rourke? What's her status?" "Critical but stable. The neurology team found a subdural hematoma. They're monitoring." He paused. "She's not going to know you're here. Not tonight." Sarah stood. "I have 4 hours left on my shift." "I know. Can you manage that?" She thought about what managing it meant. Walking back into the trauma bay, restocking carts, talking to Deanna about scheduling, acting like the last 20 minutes hadn't happened. She'd done harder versions of exactly this. In other buildings, in worse circumstances, with higher stakes and no civilian infrastructure around her. "Yes," she said. She walked back through the 42 feet of corridor and returned to the nurse's station. Deanna looked up from a chart. "Everything okay?" "Routine questions about the patient, accident scene stuff." Sarah pulled up her incident report on the terminal. "I'm going to finish this and then do a round on the post-surgical floor. Can you cover Bay 4? "Sure." Deanna watched her for a second. "You look tired. It's almost 3 in the morning." "Fair point." Sarah finished the report, submitted it, and began her round. She moved through the post-surgical floor with the particular deliberateness of someone using motion to keep the mind from getting ahead of itself. Checked the patients, checked the charts, made small talk with the overnight aide on the second floor, a 19-year-old named Marcus who was working his way through community college and always had a podcast playing on one earbud that he'd yank out whenever he heard footsteps. She was on her third round of the floor when she saw the pharmacy badge swipe log on the break room monitor. It wasn't unusual for the log to be visible. It ran on a shared display that the night staff used to track movement between departments, a system the hospital had installed 2 years ago after a medication error that had nothing to do with tampering and everything to do with poor handoff communication. Sarah had barely glanced at it in 6 years. Tonight, for no reason she could have defended to anyone, she paused. The log showed timestamps, standard entries, pharmacy staff, attending physicians, the automated dispensing system. She scrolled without touching, eyes moving down the column. There was an entry at 11:47, 40 minutes before the ambulance call came in. A badge swipe from a physician's ID accessing the secure medication room. The ID number was in the physician range, not pharmacy staff. The entry showed a duration of 6 minutes. 6 minutes in the secure medication room at 11:47, before the ambulance call that came in at 12:28. She stepped back from the monitor, took a breath. She was a night shift nurse looking at a publicly displayed access log in a break room. And what she was seeing could mean 20 different things, and she had specifically been told to talk to no one and touch nothing until Cahill's team arrived. She went back to her rounds. 38 minutes later, she heard voices near the trauma wing. Not the ordinary voices of a busy hospital. These had a different quality, the specific low register of people moving through a space they were treating as a scene rather than a building. Cahill had said 40 minutes. She took the stairs to the ground floor. The trauma wing had a secondary entrance that most of the medical staff used as a shortcut to the parking structure. Tonight it had 2 people standing near it in civilian clothes who had the same quality that Cahill had. The stillness, the attention, the particular way of occupying space that meant they were always oriented toward the most likely threat vector, even when they appeared to be looking at nothing. She didn't approach them. She watched from the end of the corridor, and after a moment, one of them, a woman, compact, with her dark hair back, turned and looked directly at Sarah with an expression that said she'd been aware of her for at least the last 30 seconds. Sarah walked to them. "Elan?" the woman said. "Yes. Agent Darcy Foss. This is Agent Holbrook." She indicated the man beside her with a slight movement of her chin. "Cahill briefed us. We need the pharmacy first. This way." She led them through the service corridor, past the break room where the log still ran on the monitor, and stopped outside the pharmacy entrance. Cahill said you'd need the access log from the secure medication room. There's an entry from 11:47 that you'll want to look at. Physician badge, 6-minute duration. Foss looked at her. Something shifted in the agent's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration. The look of someone who had come in with a set of assumptions and was quietly revising one of them. You pulled that yourself? It's on the public display in the break room. I didn't touch anything. Which badge ID? I didn't get close enough to read the number. I saw the access type and the timestamp and stepped back. She paused. I was told to observe and stay out. Good. Foss turned to Holbrook. Pull the log. I want the full ID and cross-reference with tonight's attending roster. She looked back at Sarah. How many attending physicians are in the building right now? On nights, 2. Dr. Vale in trauma and Dr. Reyes in the ED, plus the neurology consult who came in for Rourke. That would be Dr. Tamsin Park. She arrived around 1:30. Any of them leave the building between 11:45 and 12:30? Sarah thought. It was the kind of question that required her to spool back through a shift that felt very long ago now, to reconstruct the background movement of the building the way you reconstructed a room after a fire, not from what you'd been looking at, but from what you'd registered without looking. Vale was in the attending office until the radio came in. I saw his light on when I came through the main corridor at 11:30. Reyes I didn't see until after the ambulance arrived. Park I didn't see until she was called for the CT results. She paused. There was a pharmacy technician, a woman named, I don't know her name, I've only seen her on nights twice before. She came through the break room around 11:15 and left the floor. I assumed she was going to the pharmacy. Foss wrote nothing down. She seemed to be running the information into a system Sarah couldn't see. Describe her. Late 20s, brown hair, shoulder length, Cascade Valley Pharmacy scrubs. She had a lanyard, but I didn't see the badge clearly. Sarah thought harder. She was carrying a transport bag, the insulated kind, gray, with the hospital logo. That's how it moved, Holbrook said quietly. He'd been silent since the introduction, and the 2 words carried enough weight that Sarah understood he meant the medication, the tampered secondary bag. Foss nodded once. We need camera footage from the pharmacy corridor for the 11 to midnight window. Can you get us to the security office without going through the main lobby? Yes. Sarah took them through the back route, the service elevator, the maintenance corridor on the basement level, the secondary security office that ran the overnight camera monitoring. The overnight guard was a man named Gillespie, who she'd spoken to maybe 4 times in 6 years, mostly about parking disputes, and who looked at the 2 people she'd brought through his door with the expression of someone who understood immediately that this had moved past his pay grade. I need the pharmacy corridor feed, Foss said. 11 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. Gillespie looked at Sarah. It's fine, she said. Pull it. He pulled it. The 3 of them stood around his monitor and watched the footage in silence. The empty corridor, the occasional pass of a hospital staff member. And then, at 11:49, a woman in pharmacy scrubs walking toward the secure medication room with a gray insulated bag. Face angled away from the camera. Badge swiped. Door opened. 6 minutes and 14 seconds. Door closed. She walked back through the corridor with the insulated bag, and at the edge of the camera frame, she turned her face for approximately half a second in the direction of the lens. Foss said, "Pause it." Gillespie paused it. Yet the woman in the scrubs had a face that Sarah almost recognized. The almost of someone you'd seen in passing, in a building this size, maybe twice in a month, in the peripheral way you registered background faces. Not a name, not a conversation, just a presence in the building that she'd never had reason to attach to anything. That's not a pharmacy employee, Foss said. How do you know? Sarah asked. I know everyone on the pharmacy staff roster for Cascade Valley. Foss said it without elaboration. She'd already known the roster before she walked through the door, which meant this operation had been running longer than the 40 minutes since Cahill had called ahead. She accessed the building on someone else's badge. We'll find the source. She looked at Holbrook again. I need containment on the pharmacy. Nobody goes in or out until we have the full sweep. Already called. He moved toward the door. Foss turned to Sarah. You need to go back to your floor. Act normal. If Vale or anyone else asks why federal investigators are in the building, you don't know. What do I tell Deanna? Nothing. Deanna is fine. The night charge nurse doesn't have access to the secure medication room, and she's not on anyone's radar. Foss looked at her with the direct, efficient gaze of someone who had assessed her and reached a conclusion she was willing to act on. You've done everything right tonight, Ilan. Go back to your floor. Sarah went back to her floor. At 4:15 in the morning, Dr. Marcus Vale appeared at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking, and the expression of a man who had been told something he was still working through. He stood near Sarah's terminal for a moment, not quite looking at her. "There are federal investigators in the building," he said finally. "I heard. They're saying the medication, the secondary bag for Bay 4, was tampered with." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him doing the calculation that any physician does when a medication error turns into something worse than a medication error, running backward through the chain of custody, looking for the place where he should have caught it and didn't. She recognized the particular quality of that silence. She'd sat in it herself. "I checked that bag," he said. "I know. I initialed the chart. I know." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not in 6 years of working in the same building, eating in the same break room, arguing over the same equipment shortages. Something that wasn't quite humility but was adjacent to it. "You didn't argue with me," he said, "when I told you to step back." "No." "Why not?" She thought about how to answer that. The real answer was long and complicated and involved 6 years of deliberate restraint, of learning to work within systems she hadn't built, of understanding that the argument she could have won in the moment would have cost her more than the silence. "Because 10 seconds worked," she said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "What did you see that I didn't?" "The assembly method on the secondary line. It was field configuration, not standard hospital setup. Someone with specific training built that line." "And you recognized it because—" He stopped himself. She watched him make the decision to not finish the question. In 6 years, he'd never asked her where she came from before Cascade Valley. He'd never asked any of his nurses that, probably. He wasn't that kind of physician. He cared about competence in the moment, not origin stories. "You should have argued with me," he said instead. It came out rough. Not quite an apology. "Maybe," she said. "You were right, and I was dismissing you, and you should have argued. I got you to stop in 10 seconds. That's not the point." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He stood there another moment. Then he set the coffee cup on the counter. He still hadn't drunk from it, and walked back toward the trauma wing. At the edge of the corridor, he stopped without turning around. "When this is over," he said, "I want to know what training produced someone who can catch a tampered IV line on a night shift." He didn't wait for an answer. Sarah watched him go. She found herself thinking about the access log, about the woman in the pharmacy scrubs, about the 6-minute window and the gray insulated bag, and the specific knowledge required to compromise a port cap and reseal it well enough to pass a senior physician's check. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had resources and access and the kind of operational patience that didn't come from improvisation. She was still thinking about it when Cahill appeared at the end of the corridor. His face was wrong. She knew it before he spoke. The particular wrongness that comes when someone has been running a controlled operation and something has moved outside the parameters of what they controlled. "We have a problem," he said. She walked to him, kept her voice low. "What happened?" "The badge used to access the secure medication room at 1147. He paused. "It's registered to Dr. Vale." She stared at him. "His physical badge is in his office, accounted for. The swipe was digital. Someone cloned his credentials." Cahill's voice was level, but only barely. "We pulled the clone source. The duplication happened 4 days ago, during a system maintenance window. Someone inside this hospital facilitated the clone. A technician, IT. IT has 12 staff. 3 of them had access during the maintenance window. We're running them now." He looked at her. "But that's not the immediate problem." "What is?" "Major Rourke's room, the neurology floor." He said the next sentence with the flat precision of someone delivering information that doesn't benefit from surrounding it with language. "Someone accessed the room 12 minutes ago. The nurse who was supposed to be doing the room check didn't show up. We found her in the supply closet on the 4th floor. She's unharmed. She was told there was a spill situation on the 3rd floor and redirected. By the time we worked out the sequence, someone had already been in Rourke's room." Sarah's chest went tight. "Rourke is fine. Dax was in the room." He said it with a quality that was almost, not quite, but almost, something like dark amusement. "Whoever went in didn't get close to the bed. We found a partial shoe print near the door. They turned around." "The dog." Still working, still doing the job even in a hospital room at 4 in the morning with a bowl of water and a borrowed blanket. "This isn't over," Sarah said. "No." Cahill looked at her steadily. "Whoever is running this operation expected Rourke to be dead by now. She's not, and they know we're in the building, and that changes what they're willing to do next." He paused. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Go ahead." "Your separation from service. The reason that's in the file that isn't the public file." He held her gaze. "Does it have anything to do with Major Rourke, or with the unit she's attached to?" The corridor was empty and quiet. Somewhere on the floor above, a monitor beeped in a rhythm that meant someone was sleeping and stable. Sarah thought about the last 6 years, the deliberate construction of a smaller life, the decision to trade one set of stakes for another, the particular discipline of becoming someone nobody looked at twice. She thought about Vale's face when he'd said, "You should have argued with me." She thought about Dax standing at the door of Rourke's room in the dark, doing the thing he'd been built to do. "Yes," she said. Cahill went very still. "It has everything to do with it," she said. "And if you want to understand what's happening in this building tonight, you need to know what I walked away from, because I don't think this is about Rourke." She looked at the empty corridor, at the fluorescent-lit stretch of linoleum and closed doors that had been her manageable life for 6 years. "I think this is about what Rourke was about to expose. And I think the people behind it knew I was here. I think they've known for longer than tonight." The lights hummed. Somewhere below them, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, a woman who had been run off a highway was breathing with a machine's help and a dog's vigilance. And on the 4th floor of Cascade Valley Medical Center, behind a locked door that Cahill's people had reinforced with a physical deadbolt 20 minutes ago, a laptop connected to the hospital's archived record system was still open on a file that someone had accessed at 11:53, 7 minutes after the badge swipe in the pharmacy, before the ambulance call, before anyone in the building should have known that Ava Rourke existed. The file was Sarah Alon's personnel record. Cahill looked at the screen for 3 seconds longer than he needed to. Then he closed the laptop with the specific deliberateness of someone who understood that the object in front of them had just changed the nature of everything. "When did you first notice the access?" Sarah asked. "Holbrook found it 12 minutes ago. The record was opened at 11:53 and browsed for approximately 4 minutes. Whoever accessed it was looking at your service history. The civilian file, not the sealed one. Employment dates, prior addresses, certifications." He paused. "They weren't looking for what you know. They were confirming who you are. They wanted to know if I'd recognize the line. Or they wanted to know if you were the kind of person they needed to neutralize before they moved on Rourke." Cahill said it plainly, without drama, the way people who'd worked in threat assessment talked about things that would have sounded extreme in any other context. "Either way, someone inside this hospital accessed your record before the accident happened, before Rourke arrived, which means the accident wasn't opportunistic," Sarah said. "They knew she was coming to Harlow. We think she was tracked from Fort Callum. She'd been running a documentation operation for 6 weeks, pulling records on a medical program that officially doesn't exist. She was driving to a meeting with a source when the vehicle was forced off Route 9. He looked at Sarah directly. "The source was in Harlow." She waited. "We don't know who yet. Rourke didn't leave written records of the contact. Protocol." He moved away from the laptop toward the window that looked out over the empty hospital parking structure. 4 in the morning, the structure was mostly dark, and the few vehicles left in it sat in the amber pools of the overhead lights like things that had been left behind. "Tell me about the medical program. What do you know?" "What makes you think I know anything?" "Because your separation paperwork was filed 6 weeks after a classified medical review board convened at Fort Callum. And because the program Rourke was documenting was run out of a forward operating unit that your detachment supported for 8 months. He turned from the window. "You didn't walk away from the army, Elan. You were moved out, and someone made sure the reason stayed buried." The break room down the corridor had a coffee machine that worked, and Sarah thought about it with a detachment that was itself a kind of coping mechanism, the mundane object standing in for the controlled breath she wasn't taking. She'd spent 6 years not telling this story. She'd gotten good at the not telling in the way you get good at things you do every day without naming them. "The unit was running a medical trial," she said. "Officially, it was a trauma response study, protocols for treating blast injuries in the field, how to maintain cardiac function under combat conditions. The data was going to a research institution, I was told, was affiliated with the Army Medical Research Directorate. She stopped. Started again. I processed the medications. I administered treatments in the field. For 8 months, I believed I was doing medical research support under legitimate parameters. And then a soldier in my care died from a reaction that wasn't consistent with the injury he'd sustained or the treatment he'd received. I filed an incident report. The report disappeared. I filed a second one. I was told the first report had been processed and closed. She looked at the wall. The soldier's name was Private Daniel Ware. He was 22. I've thought about him every day for 6 years. Cahill was quiet. I started asking questions. The unit's medical officer, a man named Dr. Garrett Sullins, told me I was misinterpreting the data and that the incident had been reviewed and found within acceptable parameters for a trauma trial. She said the phrase with a precision that came from having repeated it in her head so many times it had worn grooves. Acceptable parameters. A 22-year-old who was alive in the morning and dead by nightfall. She looked at Cahill. 2 weeks after I filed my third incident report, I was informed I was being administratively separated. General discharge, no stated reason. My record was sealed under a provision I'd never heard of. I was told that if I discussed the program or the unit's operations publicly, I would be prosecuted under the Uniform Code. Did you sign anything? I was 28 years old, and I had just been told that my entire military record could be erased and replaced with something that would follow me forever. Yes, I signed something. She said it without apology and without the kind of retrospective self-flagellation that the moment seemed to invite. What I signed was a non-disclosure that I've been honoring for 6 years. And Rourke? I didn't know Rourke was involved in investigating the program. I didn't know she was investigating anything. I haven't had contact with anyone connected to Fort Callum since the day I left. Cahill nodded slowly. He believed her. She could see the specific quality of attention that meant someone was integrating what they were hearing rather than filtering it through prior suspicion. Rourke has been building a case for 14 months. She has documentation on 9 soldiers who died under the trial program over a 4-year period, all listed as combat-related, all with toxicology consistent with an experimental compound that wasn't in any official formulary. He paused. Daniel Ware was the first. His case was the one that opened the file. Sarah sat with that for a moment. The kind of moment that didn't announce itself, that arrived without particular ceremony and rearranged things quietly. She was trying to finish what I started, Sarah said. She was trying to finish what several people started and couldn't complete. You were the first medical witness. Your incident reports, all 3 of them, are in her case file. Copies that someone pulled before the originals were destroyed. Who pulled them? Someone inside the directorate who understood what they were looking at and had enough access to make copies before the seal went down. He looked at her steadily. We don't know who yet. That's part of what Rourke was driving to Harlow to find out. The building around them had the specific nighttime quality of an institution that never fully slept. The distant beeping of monitors, the occasional squeak of wheels on linoleum. Somewhere above them, the low hum of the HVAC system maintaining temperatures that kept people alive. Sarah had worked in this sound for 6 years. Tonight it felt like the sound of something she was standing at the edge of rather than inside. The people who ran the trial, she said, they're still operational? The program was officially discontinued 3 years ago. The personnel dispersed into other postings. But the data they generated, and more specifically the compound they were testing, is currently in the final phase of commercial development through a private defense contractor. Cahill's voice had flattened out completely. The contractor has a DoD contract valued at $800 million contingent on the compound clearing its final review. That review is in 11 days. $800 million. The number sat in the room with them and didn't need elaboration. Rourke's documentation would kill the contract, Sarah said. Rourke's documentation plus the testimony of a medical witness who was present during the trial would do more than kill the contract. It would trigger a congressional review, a criminal investigation, and the kind of public attention that doesn't go away. He looked at her. That's what tonight was. That's what the secondary bag was. They weren't just trying to kill her. They were trying to kill the case before it reached anyone who could act on it. Sarah stood up. She wasn't entirely certain why. except that the information required movement somehow, some physical acknowledgement that the world had just expanded back to a size she'd spent years trying to reduce it to. The person inside the hospital, the one who accessed my record and facilitated the pharmacy access. You said IT staff. 3 people had access during the maintenance window. We've been running background on all 3 since Holbrook pulled the log. And? Cahill's phone vibrated. He looked at it. His expression didn't change in a way that was visible, but something in the set of his jaw shifted. Excuse me a moment. He stepped out of the room. Sarah stood in the empty office and looked at the closed laptop on the table and thought about Daniel Ware, 22 years old, and about acceptable parameters, and about the specific shape of a decision she'd made 6 years ago that had felt like retreat and was possibly, in a way she hadn't been able to see from inside it, the most important thing she'd ever done. Cahill came back in 90 seconds. We have a name. He turned his phone so she could see the screen. A hospital ID photo. The standard badge photo that every Cascade Valley employee had taken on their first day. Flat light, neutral background. A man, late 30s, with the unremarkable appearance of someone who'd cultivated being unremarkable. She knew the face. Not well. Not by name. From the building. IT Systems Coordinator, Cahill said. Brennan Wick, hired 14 months ago. 14 months. The same window Rourke had been building her case. He was placed here, Sarah said. Yes. His references checked clean. His certifications are legitimate. His employment history has one gap, 8 months, 3 years ago, that he listed as contract work for a private firm. Cahill put the phone away. The firm dissolved 18 months after it was incorporated. Its only registered client was a DoD subcontractor. He didn't name the subcontractor, but she understood from the way he didn't name it that it was the same one. Foss and Holbrook are looking for him now. He hasn't badged out of the building. Sarah felt the shift, the specific, calibrated alertness that had never entirely left her body in 6 years, that she'd learned to mistake for anxiety in the context of a normal life. It wasn't anxiety, it was assessment. The reading of a situation for variables, for movement, for the thing that wasn't where it was supposed to be. If he's still in the building and he knows we're looking, she said, he's not hiding, he's finishing something. Cahill was already on his radio. The next 4 minutes were controlled urgency, the kind that happens when trained people understand the problem and move without wasting language on it. Foss responded from the second floor. Holbrook was covering the service exits. A third agent Sarah hadn't met yet was stationed outside Rourke's room on the neurology floor. Sarah stayed with Cahill because he didn't tell her not to, and she didn't ask permission. They went up to the neurology floor by the east stairwell, which was the longer route but bypassed the main corridor and the nurses' station. At the 4th floor landing, Cahill paused and listened before pushing the door open. The hallway was empty. The light outside Rourke's room showed no movement through the narrow, reinforced window. The third agent, a tall man named Price, who Sarah hadn't been introduced to, was standing 10 feet from Rourke's door with the specific stillness of someone who was doing something much more active than standing. He gave Cahill a slight head movement that Sarah parsed as clear. Then the door at the end of the corridor opened. Not Rourke's room. The supply room, 3 doors down. Brennan Wick came through it in the unhurried way of someone who'd timed his exit to the moment when the corridor should have been empty. He was in civilian clothes, not hospital scrubs, with a bag over one shoulder that was shaped wrong, too rigid, one side heavier than the other. He'd gotten 3 steps into the corridor before he registered that it wasn't empty. He stopped. Price was already moving. Wick ran. Not for the stairwell, for the utility room at the opposite end, the one that connected to the maintenance shaft. Sarah knew the building well enough to know that the maintenance shaft came out in the basement near the loading dock, that the loading dock had an exterior door that was supposed to be alarmed and sometimes wasn't because the alarm had been malfunctioning for 8 weeks, and the maintenance work order was still open. She knew this because she was a night shift nurse who walked every floor of this building and paid attention. Loading dock, she said. Basement, east side. The alarm is down. Cahill was on the radio before she finished the sentence. Wick made it to the utility room. The door closed. Price hit it 6 seconds later, and Sarah heard the muffled impact of a shoulder against a lock that hadn't given. She was already moving toward the east stairwell, not chasing, calculating, because the maintenance shaft ran parallel to the stairwell and if she took the stairs fast enough, she'd be at the basement level before Wick cleared the shaft. She was not supposed to be doing this. She was aware of that with a clarity that sat alongside the doing of it without stopping either one. She went down 4 flights in the dark of the stairwell with her hand on the rail and her footsteps as quiet as she could make them on metal grating, and she came through the basement door into the loading corridor at the moment that Brennan Wick dropped from the maintenance shaft access panel 12 feet ahead of her. He heard her, turned. They looked at each other for a full second. His hand went toward the bag. "Don't," she said. He was running the same calculation she was. She was a nurse in scrubs with no visible authority and no visible weapon, standing between him and the loading dock door. She was also, from the way she was standing, possibly not just a nurse. "Move," he said. "No." He pulled the bag off his shoulder and swung it. Not at her, at the wall-mounted electrical panel beside the door. The impact was deliberate and specific, the strike of someone who knew exactly what he was hitting, and the corridor lights went out. Darkness. The particular basement dark of a hospital at 4:30 in the morning. Not complete, because emergency lighting kicked in from the ceiling strips, but disorienting enough that Sarah lost his position for 2 full seconds. She heard the loading dock door. She hit the crash bar with her shoulder and came through into the exterior loading area, where the amber security light showed Wick crossing the concrete toward the service road. She was faster than he'd estimated. She saw the slight miscalculation in the way he adjusted when he heard her behind him. And she was thinking about distance and angles and the specific fact that she was not equipped to physically stop a man who was larger than her and motivated in ways she was not going to match. She was thinking about that when the vehicle appeared at the end of the service road. Not Cahill's people. The vehicle was dark, no markings, moving too fast for a hospital approach. It came around the corner of the loading bay with the acceleration of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Wick saw it and ran toward it. Sarah stopped running, stood in the center of the loading area and watched the vehicle close the distance and thought about the fact that in 11 seconds, Brennan Wick was going to reach that car with everything he was carrying and disappear, and that everything in the bag over his shoulder was either evidence or a threat or both, and that Cahill's people were 40 seconds behind her at minimum. She looked at the loading bay, at the concrete bollards along the service road edge, at the vehicle's approach angle. She ran left, to the bollard control panel, the old hydraulic system that the hospital had installed to protect the loading bay from vehicle incursions. The system that had been installed after a delivery truck had come in too hot 4 years ago and taken out the bay doors. The system that was operated by a key switch that was supposed to be locked but wasn't, because the key had been left in the panel during the last maintenance check, and Deanna had complained about it in a staff meeting 3 weeks ago, and the complaint had been logged and not yet acted on. Sarah turned the key. The bollards came up from the service road with a hydraulic thunk that she felt in her chest. 3 of them, chest-high steel posts rising from the concrete in the vehicle's path. The driver saw them, braked hard. The vehicle stopped 8 feet short of the nearest bollard with its headlights cutting through the loading area, and for a moment the scene was exactly that. Stopped. Wick was 10 feet from the car. He looked at the bollards, looked at Sarah standing at the panel, made another calculation. Cahill came through the loading dock door. Then Foss, from the service road entrance on the far side of the bay. Wick stood in the center of the loading area with the bag on his shoulder and the stopped vehicle in front of him, and federal agents approaching from both sides, and Sarah could see the exact moment that the calculation resolved. The stillness that came when someone ran the numbers and got an answer they hadn't wanted. He put the bag on the ground. The vehicle reversed. It made it 20 feet before Holbrook's car came around the corner of the service road and blocked the exit. Foss reached Wick first. Sarah stayed at the bollard panel and watched the takedown with the specific detachment of someone who was not going to let herself feel the adrenaline until it was over, because feeling it meant acknowledging how close any of this had come to going differently. Cahill came to stand beside her. I was breathing harder than he would have liked, she suspected. The bollard system, he said. Maintenance left the key in. How did you know about it? I work nights. I know the building. He was quiet for a moment. Around the loading bay, things were moving. Foss managing Wick, Holbrook dealing with the blocked vehicle, radio traffic layering over radio traffic in the way of an operation that had reached its acute phase and was now moving through the necessary aftermath. The bag, Sarah said. What's in it? We'll know in a few minutes. She waited. It took less than a few minutes. Foss was methodical and fast, and she had the bag open and its contents cataloged in 90 seconds. 90 seconds. She carried an evidence bag to Cahill and showed him the contents without handing them over. A drive. An injector, preloaded, the kind used for rapid IM delivery. 2 vials. A secondary port cap identical to the one Sarah had pulled from the IV line hours earlier. Sarah looked at the injector. He was going for Rourke's room. The supply room he came out of is directly above the neurology floor via the maintenance shaft. He was going to come through the ceiling access. Foss's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the precision of someone controlling their own reaction to what they were looking at. If Price hadn't been positioned right, if the corridor hadn't been covered, but it was, Cahill said, firmly, ending that particular line of thought. Sarah looked at the vials. They were labeled in a notation she half recognized, not hospital pharmacy labeling, something older, a documentation format she'd last seen on medications in a field kit 8 months before she separated from the Army. That's the compound, she said. Foss looked at her sharply. From the trial. The notation format. She pointed without touching. That's the same labeling system they used on the experimental medications in the field. I prepared versions of this for 8 months. She looked up. I wasn't just trying to kill Rourke. He was going to administer the compound directly. A documented exposure on a living witness would have contaminated her testimony. Any attorney could have argued her account was the product of the neurological effects. The loading bay was quiet for a moment. She's the case, Foss said. Not a question. Everything she has is documented evidence, but she's also the witness who can testify to what she saw and how she got it. Without her testimony, the documentation is harder to prosecute. Sarah looked at the drive in the evidence bag. What's on that? Cahill looked at Foss. Foss looked at Holbrook, who had returned from the service road entrance. Something moved between the three of them that wasn't quite spoken. We don't know yet, Cahill said, carefully. But Wick wouldn't have been carrying it for backup. If he had it with him, it's because it was going with him, not staying here. He was pulling out, Sarah said. The car wasn't extraction, it was evac. He'd done everything he was sent to do, or thought he had, and he was clearing the building before your team could pin his access log to a name. Almost, Cahill said. Almost, she agreed. The eastern sky beyond the loading bay was not yet light, but it had reached the particular quality of pre-dawn that wasn't darkness anymore either. Sarah stood at the edge of the concrete and felt the cold of the Oregon morning against her arms, and thought about Daniel Ware, and about acceptable parameters, and about the 6 years between then and now, and about the fact that Ava Rourke was in a room on the 4th floor of this building, alive, with a dog named Dax at the foot of her bed. She was thinking about all of that when Cahill's radio broke the quiet with Price's voice from the neurology floor, tight with a controlled urgency that Sarah had heard before in enough context to know what it meant before the words arrived. Cahill, we have a problem up here. Rourke's monitors just dropped. It's not Wick. This is something in the system. Sarah was already moving back through the loading dock door. What system? Cahill said into the radio as he came after her. Price's response crackled. The IV pump. Someone remotely accessed the pump protocol. We don't know from where and we don't know how long ago it was set, but the rate just changed and the alarm was suppressed. She's been getting an elevated dose of something for... His voice cut out for a second. We don't know how long. Sarah hit the stairwell door and went up. 4 flights. She counted them without counting them, the way the body takes over when the mind is already somewhere else. Already in the room, already at the bedside, already running the assessment of what an elevated and unknown infusion rate for an unknown duration did to a patient with a subdural hematoma and a compromised cardiac history. She came through the 4th floor door and down the corridor and into Rourke's room, and the neurology attending on call, a young doctor named Marsh who had been pulled from his on-call room and was still pulling his coat on, was at the IV pump trying to manually override the protocol. Dax stood at the bedside, pressed against the mattress, his eyes on the pump. He'd been alerting. Nobody had read it as an alert because nobody in the room had known how to read it. Sarah reached past Marsh and killed the pump. Get me her current vitals and I need to know what's in that line right now. Pull a sample from the port before you do anything else. She looked at Rourke. The Major's color was wrong, the gray-tinged pallor of someone whose peripheral circulation was backing down. Her respirations were still present, not labored, But the rhythm was off in the way that meant the problem was cardiac and not respiratory. Marsh pulled the sample, called out the vitals. Blood pressure low but not critical. Heart rate dropping, 62, 60, 58. Sarah looked at the pump's history log. The record of rate changes was still visible on the screen before the system reset. The rate had been altered remotely at 3:52 in the morning, 41 minutes ago. The alarm suppression had been written into the command protocol. What was in the original bag? She asked. Standard saline with a dopamine adjunct for pressure maintenance. It was set by the neurology attending at 2:15. Sarah looked at the sample vial Marsh had pulled. The fluid was slightly off color, not dramatically, the way movie contaminations were off color, but subtly, the way something was off color when you were looking for it and wouldn't be if you weren't. This isn't the original bag. The bag was swapped, probably during the window when the nurse was redirected. Marsh went pale. What do I need to? Discontinue the line, new IV, clean access, different site. I need a full panel, cardiac enzymes, a tox screen that includes the expanded military formulary, not just the standard panel, and I need it run at the state lab, not the hospital's internal system. She said the last part because the hospital's internal system had already demonstrated that it could be accessed and altered. Marsh stared at her for half a second. Now. He moved. He was a second-year neurology fellow who had been in practice for 26 months and had never had a conversation like the one he'd just had, but he moved with the specific, useful quality of someone who would process the strangeness later and do the job now. Sarah stood at the bedside and watched Rourke's monitors and did the arithmetic of 41 minutes at an elevated rate with an unknown compound, calculating against what she knew about the drug from 8 months of field administration and the specific toxicology of a patient with blunt force head trauma. And the arithmetic was not reassuring, but it was not catastrophic, and the difference between those two things was the window they were working in. Dax pressed his nose briefly against her hand. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes on the monitor. The heart rate stabilized at 56. Held, didn't drop further. Marsh came back with the new IV. She checked his setup, checked it thoroughly, the way she'd checked the setup in the trauma bay hours ago, the same instinct running the same protocol. It was clean. They ran the new line. Within 8 minutes, the color in Rourke's face began to shift back towards something viable. It was not a dramatic change, it was the slow, undramatic correction of a body being given back what it needed and beginning to use it. But Sarah had been watching enough monitors in enough conditions to know the difference between a vital sign trending toward danger and one trending away from it. Cahill had come into the room at some point. She wasn't sure when. I was standing near the door with the particular stillness of a man who understood that this was not a space for him to be useful in and was staying out of the way accordingly. She's stabilizing, Sarah said, without turning around. What did they give her? I won't know until the tox screen. My best estimate, based on the color change and the cardiac response, is the same compound that was in the secondary bag in the trauma bay. Lower concentration, longer delivery window. She paused. Whoever programmed the pump knew the dosing parameters. This was calculated. Wick? He was in the building, but the remote access could have been initiated from anywhere. He may have set it before he ever went to the supply room, or someone else on the network triggered it. She turned around. Do you have the drive from his bag? Forensics has it. How long to read it? Depends on encryption. Could be an hour, could be longer. She looked at Rourke. The major's chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of someone sleeping, which she was, in the specific clinical sense of someone whose brain had been protected from further harm by the sedation the neurology team had maintained. She did not look like a woman who had spent the night being targeted by people with 800 million reasons to want her dead. She looked like a patient in a hospital bed. She needs someone with her who can read the signs, Sarah said. Not just monitors, the actual clinical picture. If they got into the pump protocol once, the network access that allowed it may still be open. I'm posting Price at the door. Price can stop someone from entering. He can't tell you what the monitors are saying. Cahill looked at her. Are you offering? Sarah looked at the room. At the pump, now clean and running correctly. At Dax, who had settled back to his position at the foot of the bed with the specific relief of an animal whose alert had been answered. At Rourke's face, which she'd been looking at since the trauma bay. as the face of a stranger and was only now beginning to understand was something else. "I'm staying until the talk screen comes back," she said. "After that, we'll see." Cahill nodded once. He stepped out. The door closed. Sarah pulled the chair from the corner of the room to the bedside. Sat down. The monitors beeped in their steady rhythm. Outside the window, the pre-dawn had moved a degree closer toward morning. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when Holbrook knocked and came through the door with an expression she'd learned to read in the last several hours. The contained, specific expression of someone carrying information that was both expected and worse than expected. "The drive," he said. "What's on it?" He looked at her with something that was not quite hesitation and not quite reluctance, more like the look of someone choosing the cleanest way to say an ugly thing. "Personnel files, 12 of them. Medical records from the trial period flagged for destruction. Toxicology reports that contradict the official cause of death determinations." He paused. "And a document that appears to be an authorization memo. It's dated 4 years ago. It approves the continuation of the trial program past the point where the internal safety review recommended termination." "Who signed it?" Holbrook looked at her steadily. "The signature is from the Office of the Army Surgeon General." Sarah sat with that. "There's a second signature," Holbrook said, "co-authorization, from the medical director of the contracting firm." He paused again, and this time the pause had a weight that prepared her. "The name on the second signature is Dr. Garrett Sullins." The room was very quiet. Dr. Garrett Sullins, the unit's medical officer. The man who had told her the death of Daniel Ware was within acceptable parameters. The man who had been present for all 8 months of her deployment and who had signed off on every treatment protocol she'd administered. "He's still practicing," Holbrook said. "He left the Army 2 years after you separated. He's been the chief medical officer of the contracting firm for the past 18 months. Sarah looked at Rourke's face. The woman who had spent 14 months building a case that put Sullins' name on a document that proved he'd authorized the continuation of a program that killed 12 soldiers after his own safety review had told him to stop. The woman who had been run off a highway and poisoned twice in a single night to prevent that document from reaching anyone who could use it. Sarah was still looking at the monitor when the door opened again. Not Cahill. Not Holbrook. A man she didn't recognize. Hospital ID, administrator's badge, the kind of suit that nobody in Cascade Valley's administration wore at 5 in the morning. He was in his 50s, with the composure of someone who had cultivated composure as a professional tool, and he walked into the room with the specific authority of someone who expected rooms to accommodate him. He looked at Rourke, then at Sarah. "Nurse," he said, with the particular inflection that reduced the word to a category rather than a title. "I'll need you to step out." She didn't move. "This patient is under administrative review. I'm authorized to access this room." "By whom?" He smiled. It was the smile of someone who had used it to end conversations for a long time. "That's above your pay grade. I need you to step outside." Sarah looked at his badge, at the name on it, at the hospital ID photo that matched the man in front of her in every detail except one. The ID photo had a visible lanyard with a secondary badge below it, the kind of secondary credential that hospital administrators carried for system access, the kind that could be used to remotely access networked medical equipment. She looked at his hands. "What's your name?" she asked. "I told you, step outside." "I'm asking for your name." He took a step into the room. Dax came off the foot of the bed. Dax didn't bark. That was the thing Sarah would remember afterward. The dog didn't make a sound. He simply moved off the bed and placed himself between the man and Ava Rourke with the particular economy of an animal that had done this before and understood that noise was not the point. The man in the suit stopped. His composure held, but it held the way a surface holds when there's pressure underneath it, visibly, effortfully, with the faint quality of something that might give. He looked at the dog, then at Sarah, then back at the dog, which was watching him with the specific attention that working animals reserve for things they have categorized as threats. "Call it off," he said. "He's not mine to call." The man took a half step backward toward the door. Not retreat, recalculation. Sarah had seen that move before in other contexts, on other people, and she knew what it meant. He was deciding whether the situation was still recoverable, whether whatever he'd come to do could still be done under different parameters. She stood up. "Your badge," she said. "The secondary credential. The one below your ID. What system does it access? He didn't answer. You were in the building when the pump protocol was altered at 3:52, she said. She didn't know that for certain. She was building it from the components she had. The administrator's badge, the system access, the timing, the fact that he was in this room at 5 in the morning with an explanation that hadn't survived 10 seconds of examination. Someone with administrator-level network credentials issued a remote command to the IV pump. That kind of access doesn't come from IT staff. It comes from the people IT staff answer to. His jaw moved, a small, tight motion. I'm going to need your name, she said again. Cahill came through the door. He took in the room, the man, the dog, Sarah standing between the two. In approximately 1.5 seconds, his hand went to his jacket. Not theatrically, just the specific unconscious movement of someone whose threat assessment had resolved and whose body was already responding. Mr. Aldrich Noom, Cahill said. The man's composure slipped, just slightly, just enough. Chief Operations Officer, Vandermeer Defense Solutions. Cahill kept his voice even. The company with the $800 million contract currently in final review. He moved into the room, not rushing, placing himself at an angle that completed the geometry of containment. Holbrook is pulling your badge swipe log from the server room right now. I'm going to guess it shows you in the building since before midnight. Noom said nothing. The vehicle at the loading dock is registered to a shell company that traces back to Vandermeer's operational budget. Wick is in federal custody. The drive is in evidence. Cahill looked at him with the flat patience of someone who has stopped needing the other person to confirm anything. You came here to see whether you needed to clean up after him, whether Rourke was still alive. I have nothing to say to you, Noom said. I want legal counsel. You'll have it. Cahill moved to the door and opened it. Price was in the corridor. Take him downstairs, keep him separate from Wick. He waited until Noom was out of the room and the door had closed before he turned to Sarah. The badge swipe log will take about 20 minutes to pull, but you're right about the access level. IT doesn't have pump-level remote commands. That requires system administrator clearance, which in this hospital means the COO tier. He's been here before, Sarah said. Not tonight, before. He knew the layout. He knew which room she was in. Vandermeer has a partnership with Cascade Valley's parent network. They provide equipment, infusion pumps, monitoring systems, to 43 hospitals in the Western region under a 5-year supply contract. Cahill said it with the specific tone of someone reading from a document they wish they'd read earlier. The network access was built into the contract, standard remote monitoring for equipment maintenance. Sarah heard what he wasn't saying. Standard remote monitoring that also gave them the ability to alter pump protocols from outside the building. From anywhere with a network connection. He paused. We didn't know about the hospital's supply contract until Holbrook pulled Vandermeer's corporate filings 20 minutes ago. Rourke didn't have it either. She'd been focused on the military contract. The civil infrastructure connections were a separate layer. Sarah looked at the pump. It sat in its corner of the room, clean and running, with no indication of what it had been made to do. It was exactly the same pump that sat in every room in this hospital. Reliable, familiar, the kind of equipment that medical staff stopped seeing because it was always there and always functioning and never warranted a second look. 43 hospitals. The same equipment. The same remote access. The same capacity to reach through a network and alter the thing keeping a patient alive, from anywhere, at any time, with enough precision to suppress the alarm. How many of those 43 hospitals have patients that Vandermeer would have a reason to be concerned about? She asked. Cahill looked at her. That's a question we're going to be asking for a while. She sat back down. The monitors showed Rourke's stabilized vitals, heart rate 58 and holding, blood pressure climbing back toward something viable. The tox screen was still running at the state lab. It would take another hour, minimum. Sarah sat in the chair at the bedside and thought about the supply contract and the pump network and the 43 hospitals and the specific horror of an infrastructure that had been built to look like a service and was also a weapon. And she thought about the $800 million contract and the 12 soldiers and Daniel Ware and acceptable parameters. And she thought about Garrett Sullins, who was, right now, in some office somewhere at the medical directorate of Vandermeer Defense Solutions, presumably asleep, presumably unaware that his authorization signature was sitting in a federal evidence bag in the loading bay of Cascade Valley Medical Center. She thought about what it was going to feel like when he found out. Holbrook came back with the badge swipe log at 5:47 in the morning. He laid a printed summary on the room's small side table and let Sarah read it without comment. Noom had badged into the building at 11:31. He'd accessed the server room, using a contractor credential that Vandermeer's supply contract entitled him to at 11:44. He'd left the server room at 12:08 and moved to the administrative floor, where he'd remained until just before 5. The swipe log showed him in the building for 5 hours and 37 minutes before he walked into Rourke's room. The pump protocol had been altered remotely at 3:52. He'd had 23 minutes alone in the server room, more than enough. He didn't need WIC for the pump, Sarah said. WIC was for the physical approach. In case the medication in the trauma bay didn't work, in case the pump didn't work, WIC was the contingency. She thought about the injector in WIC's bag. The direct administration. The last option. They had 3 layers. 4, Holbrook said. The vehicle on Route 9 was first. Run her off the road, let the crash do it. If she survived, the medication in the trauma bay. If that failed, the pump. If the pump wasn't enough, WIC with direct administration. He said it without inflection, the way you state a sequence when the sequence itself is enough. This was planned over days, maybe longer. They were prepared for contingencies. And none of it worked. No. He looked at her. None of it worked. She handed the log back to him. The next hour was the particular aftermath quiet of a building that had been the site of something significant and was now absorbing it. Cahill coordinated from the administrative floor. Fos managed the evidence chain from the loading bay. Holbrook moved between both. Sarah stayed in Rourke's room because she'd said she would, and because the monitors still warranted watching, and because Dax had settled back onto his position at the foot of the bed, and something about his willingness to rest felt like information she trusted. At 6:50 in the morning, Dr. Vale appeared in the doorway. He'd been in the building the entire time. It occurred to Sarah only now that he'd been in the building through the whole of it, running his trauma bay and his attending responsibilities, without knowing that the structure around him had been compromised, and then, slowly, noisily, imperfectly, reclaimed. He looked tired in the way of someone who had been tired since midnight and had stopped noticing it. He looked at Rourke, at the monitors, at Dax, at Sarah. The federal team briefed me, he said, about the pump. Okay. And about the pharmacy. The full picture. He came into the room and stood near the window. Outside, the Oregon morning had arrived. Low cloud, the flat gray light of a Pacific Coast early hour. The COO of the company that makes this pump. Yes. He's in custody. Yes. Vale was quiet for a moment. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was looking at the pump with an expression that was not easy to read because it was not one thing. Anger, certainly. The specific anger of a physician who had been used as a blind instrument in something that violated every premise of what he'd spent nearly 3 decades doing. But also something more complicated than anger. The particular discomfort of a competent person confronting the limit of their competence. He'd checked the medication. He'd signed the chart. He'd run the trauma bay by every standard he knew. None of it had been enough for what this actually was. You knew what you were looking at, he said, in the trauma bay. When you looked at the secondary line. I had context you didn't have. Don't. He said it without heat. Don't manage it. I was dismissing you while you were reading something I didn't have the training to see. That's the fact. He paused. I've been a physician for 28 years. I have never had a nurse pull an IV line that I'd already checked and initialed. You let me do it. Eventually, after you had to fight for 10 seconds. He turned from the window. That's not the same thing as listening. She didn't argue the point because it wasn't arguable. It's done, she said. It's not done for me. He said it with the particular stubbornness of someone who intended to sit with a thing rather than resolve it quickly. I'm going to be thinking about how I dismissed you for a long time. He looked at Rourke one more time. She's going to make it? The talk screen will tell us more, but her vitals are moving in the right direction. He nodded. If you need anything from me, documentation, testimony, whatever the investigation requires, I'll provide it. He paused at the door. All of it. Whatever I saw and whatever I missed. He left. Sarah sat for a moment with the specific texture of that conversation, with the fact that Vale saying, "I'll provide all of it, whatever I missed," was a harder thing for him to say than anything that had come before it, and that he'd said it without performing the difficulty, and that this was possibly the closest she was going to get, from him to the thing he didn't quite know how to give her. It was enough. The talk screen came back at 8:14. Sarah read it on Holbrook's tablet, the state lab report, clinical and specific, identifying the compound by its experimental designation and its concentration level and its rate of accumulation in the bloodstream over the delivery window. The concentration was high enough to have caused a secondary cardiac event in a patient with Rourke's profile over a 3 to 4 hour window if delivery had continued. It hadn't continued. The report also confirmed a match to the molecular signature that Rourke's case file had documented in the historical samples from the trial period. The compound in the IV pump, the compound in the secondary bag from the trauma bay, and the compound documented in the toxicology reports of 12 deceased soldiers were the same molecule. A chain of evidence that began in a field kit 8 months into Sarah's deployment and ended in a hospital room in Harlow, Oregon at 8:14 in the morning. Cahill read the report over her shoulder and didn't say anything for a full minute. Then, "This goes to the Surgeon General's office and the Congressional Oversight Committee simultaneously. We don't route it through DoD channels because DoD channels are part of what we're investigating." "What about the contract review? The 11 days?" "The contract review is going to be the least of Vandermeer's concerns by this afternoon." He took the tablet back. "We have the authorization signature. We have the compound match. We have Wick in custody and Noom in custody. And we have the pump access log and the badge swipe timeline." He paused. "And we have your testimony. 6 years of documentation from a medical witness who was on site during the trial and filed incident reports that were subsequently destroyed. I signed a non-disclosure. The non-disclosure was obtained under duress from a service member facing administrative separation. It won't survive a federal court review, and whoever wrote it knows that." He looked at her. "We're going to need you to give a formal statement, today if possible." "I know. I want to be clear about what that means. Your name will be part of a federal investigation. The sealed portion of your record will be opened. Everything you've kept quiet for 6 years will be documented and public." "I know," she said again. She looked at Rourke, the woman who had spent 14 months doing what Sarah had decided she couldn't, the woman who had driven toward a source in Harlow on a highway at night because the documentation was almost complete and the case was almost ready and almost was close enough to be worth the risk. "I should have done this 6 years ago," Sarah said. "You weren't in a position to," Cahill said. "You were 28 and alone and they had everything they needed to destroy you. That's not a failure of courage. That's the math." She didn't entirely believe him, but she understood that she was going to have to hold both things, the choice she'd made and the different choice she was making now, and that holding both of them without resolving one into the other was going to take more time than she currently had. "Get me the statement form," she said. He did. Sarah gave her formal statement in the administrative conference room on the second floor, with Foss taking the record and Holbrook as witness, at 9:15 in the morning. She'd been awake for more than 24 hours by that point, and her voice was flat with fatigue, and she told the complete story without ornamentation and without apology. Daniel Ware, the trial program, the medication she'd administered, the incident reports, the administrative separation, the non-disclosure, the 6 years of Cascade Valley, in 140 minutes of testimony that she delivered without stopping except twice for water. When she finished, Foss said, "Is there anything you want to add?" Sarah thought about it. "The soldiers in Rourke's case file, the 12. I want to know their names." Foss looked at her. "We can arrange that. I knew about one of Daniel Ware. I've been thinking about him for 6 years, and I didn't know there were 11 others." She paused. "I want to know their names." Foss wrote something on her pad. "Done." Sarah left the conference room at 11:40 in the morning. The building was running its daytime operations around her, so day shift staff. The mid-morning rush of outpatient appointments. The ordinary noise of an institution doing what institutions do. She walked through it with the particular transparency of someone who'd been awake too long, moving through space that felt slightly unmoored from its usual proportions. She was at the elevator when Dr. Vale found her again. He had a piece of paper in his hand. Not a chart, not a form, a printed email. This came to my administrative account 20 minutes ago, he said. Copied to the hospital board and the CMO. He handed it to her. It was from the regional director of the federal investigation, a 2-paragraph notification informing Cascade Valley Medical Center's leadership that nurse Sarah Elan had taken actions during the previous night's events that had directly prevented the deaths of at least 2 individuals and had provided material assistance to an active federal investigation. It was formal and clinical in the way of official communications, and it used language that said nothing dramatic and meant everything. She read it twice. The board wants to speak with you, Vale said, when you're ready. Not urgently. They understand the circumstances, but they want to speak with you. She handed the paper back to him. Keep it, he said. That one's for you. She held it, looked at it, put it in the pocket of her scrubs. Go home, Vale said. Sleep. Come back when you're human again. She almost smiled. Is that a medical recommendation? It's the only useful thing I can offer you right now, so yes. He paused. Elan, what you did last night, I'm not going to pretend I fully understand all of it, but I know what the monitors showed when you took over in that room, and I know what they showed afterward. I know the difference. He stopped himself, started again. You're a nurse. You've always been a nurse, whatever else you are. That's not a diminishment. It was possibly the most honest thing he'd said to her in 6 years, and it landed the way honest things do. Not cleanly, not without complication, but with weight. She was still carrying it when she walked out of the elevator and toward the parking structure, her car keys in her hand and the morning light coming through the structure's open sides in long, flat panels. She sat in her car and did not start it. She was thinking about the statement she'd given, about the 12 names she didn't yet know, about the compound in the pump and the compound in the secondary bag, and the compound in the field kit she'd opened 8 months long ago in a dry, high-altitude landscape that she'd tried very hard to forget. About Garrett Sullins, who at this moment, she checked her watch, 11:53, was presumably in his office at Vandermeer Defense Solutions, approximately 240 miles from where she was sitting, beginning his workday. She was thinking about all of this when her phone rang. Cahill. She answered. Sullins, he said, we issued the warrant at 11:30. She exhaled. Okay. His office is cooperating. We expected resistance. The company's legal team is already mobilizing. They called in 6 attorneys in the last 90 minutes. But Sullins himself, Cahill paused. He asked to speak to you. The parking structure was quiet. A car moved past on the level below. He knows you're in Harlow, Cahill said. He knows what you testified to. He's asking for a conversation before we bring him in. He says he has something that isn't in the case file, and he'll only give it to you. Sarah looked at her keys. 6 years ago, in a room not unlike the conference room she'd spent the last 140 minutes in, Garrett Sullins had sat across a table and told her that Daniel Ware's death was within acceptable parameters. He'd said it with the composure of a man who'd made a calculation and was comfortable with the result. He'd said it, and then he'd watched the paperwork that separated her from the army move across the table, and he had not stopped it. What does he say he has? She asked. He wouldn't tell me. He said you'd understand when you heard it. Cahill's voice carried neither pressure nor reassurance. He was giving her the information and leaving the architecture of the decision to her. You don't have to. We have enough without it. She knew that. She also knew that Sullins had been inside the program for its entire duration, that he'd signed the authorization memo that Rourke's case was built on, and that the thing he was offering, whatever it was, had to be significant enough that he'd decided it was worth trading. Where is he? She asked. Still in his office. We have agents on site. I want a recorded line and I want Foss in the room. I can have that set up in 40 minutes. She started the car, then she stopped. Cahill? Yeah. The drive from Wick's bag, the personnel files, the 12 soldiers. Yes. Were there more? Beyond what Rourke documented? A pause. Short, but she heard it. The forensics team is still working through the drive. There's a second partition that required a secondary decryption key. We got it open 20 minutes ago. He stopped. How many? She asked. He told her. The number was not 12. Sarah sat in the parking structure with the engine running and the morning light coming in at its flat angle, and the number Cahill had just said sitting in the space between what she'd known this was and what it actually was. Not 12 soldiers, 27. And among the files in the second partition, among the documents that Brennan Wick had been carrying out of the building, that Aldrich Noom had come to ensure were removed, there was a record she hadn't expected, a medical file, with her name on it. Not her civilian name, her service name. Sergeant Sarah Ilan, 19th Medical Detachment. A file that documented, in clinical notation, every medication she had administered during her 8 months of deployment, every compound she had prepared and delivered, every patient she had treated. And at the bottom of the file, a notation dated 6 years ago, in the week before her administrative separation. In Sullen's handwriting, subject has been exposed, recommend monitoring, do not recall, civilian transition preferable for containment. She was still reading it when Cahill said, "Sarah." She hadn't realized she'd gone silent. "She'd been exposed," Cahill said carefully. "The compound. During your deployment, the file documents trace exposure from handling the medications without knowing what they were." He paused. "We don't know the long-term implications yet. The medical team will need to—" "He knew," she said. "When he separated me, he knew I'd been exposed and he let me go without telling me." The parking structure was very quiet. "Yes," Cahill said. She put the car in drive. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. "Have Sullens on the line." She drove the 20 minutes without the radio. The silence wasn't peaceful. It had texture and weight, the kind that comes when a person is holding something too large to put down and too heavy to keep carrying the same way they have been. The Oregon morning moved past the windows in its gray, unhurried way, and Sarah drove through it with both hands on the wheel and the number 27 sitting somewhere in her chest where it was going to stay for a long time. Not 12. 27. And her own name in a file that Sullens had written 6 years ago and never told her about. She'd spent 6 years monitoring her own health with the particular vigilance of someone who worked in medicine and understood what bodies did when they were asked to sustain damage quietly. She'd attributed the fatigue to shift work, the occasional arrhythmia to caffeine and poor sleep, the things that didn't quite resolve to the ordinary wear of a life lived in fluorescent-lit rooms at hours the body was never designed for. She'd told herself that story with enough consistency that she'd stopped questioning it. Sullens had known. He'd written subject has been exposed, and then he'd signed the papers that walked her out of the Army and into a civilian life where no one would monitor her, where no one was responsible for her, where the exposure and its consequences were no longer his problem. She pulled into the hospital parking structure and sat for 30 seconds in the car. Then she got out. Cahill had the conference room set up, a laptop, a speaker, Foss at the table with a recording device, and the particular focused stillness of someone who understood the stakes of the next conversation. Sarah came through the door and didn't sit. She stood at the end of the table and looked at the laptop screen, which showed a video feed from 240 miles away, an office, 2 federal agents visible at the edges, and Garrett Sullens sitting in a chair that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. He was 61. She knew this the way she knew everything about him, from the 8 months when she'd worked in his unit and read his face for information, the way you read everything around you when your survival depends on accurate interpretation. He'd aged since then, but not in the ways she'd expected. He looked less substantial than she remembered, smaller. The specific reduction that happens to people when the infrastructure of their authority is removed and you see them without it. He looked at the camera. His expression was the careful neutral of a man who had decided on a strategy and was holding to it. "Sergeant Ilan," he said. "You don't get to call me that," she said. "Not anymore." A pause. "Sarah, then. Say what you have to say." He folded his hands on the desk in front of him. They were steady. She'd give him that. "I want you to know that what was done to you was not my decision. The separation, the non-disclosure, that came from above my authorization level. I filed the exposure notation because I believed someone higher up the chain would initiate monitoring. I was wrong about that." "You were wrong," she said. "Yes. 27 soldiers are dead. Daniel Ware has been dead for 6 years, and you were wrong." He didn't flinch. She'd half expected him to, and his not flinching was almost worse. The composure of someone who had been carrying this and had learned to carry it without visible strain, which meant he'd made a certain kind of peace with it that she found more disturbing than if he'd broken. "What do you have?" she asked. "The thing that isn't in the case file." He reached off screen and brought back a folder. Physical paper, not digital. He opened it and held the first page up to the camera. Sarah looked at it. She couldn't read the small print from the video feed, but she could see the letterhead and she could see the date. "This is the original safety review," Sullins said. "The one I filed when the internal data showed the compound was producing cardiac events at a rate outside the acceptable trial parameters. The version in the case file is a redacted copy. This is the original. It contains the names of the 2 Surgeon General's office representatives who received it and signed acknowledgement of receipt." He set it down. They knew. Not just that the trial was producing deaths, they knew that I had flagged it and recommended termination, and they overrode the recommendation in writing. Their signatures are on the override authorization. He paused. "That document is not in Rourke's case file because she didn't know it existed. I've had it for 4 years. Sarah looked at Cahill. Cahill was already on his phone. "Why are you giving it now?" she asked. Sullins looked at the camera for a moment. "Because Wick and Noom are in custody, and the contract is finished, and I am 61 years old and I am tired." He said it without drama, without the performance of remorse. Just the flat statement of a man who had done the arithmetic and found it wanting. "And because I know what my signature on that authorization memo looks like. I know what I am going to be charged with. I'm not giving this to trade. I have no illusions about what giving this gets me. I'm giving it because the 2 men who made the decision that I implemented are not in custody and should be." It was not an apology. She hadn't expected one. She wasn't sure an apology would have done anything useful for her anyway. Apologies required the other person to do something with them, and she wasn't ready to figure out what she'd do with his. "Have your agents take the folder," she said to Cahill. Cahill spoke into his phone. On the video feed, one of the 2 agents in the room moved toward the desk. Sullins held the folder out. Then he stopped, looked at the camera one more time. "The exposure notation in your file," he said. "I should have told you directly. I know that. Whatever monitoring you need, whatever medical evaluation, I will provide documentation of every compound you were exposed to and at what concentrations." He paused. "That much I can give you." She looked at him for a long moment. She was thinking about Daniel Ware, about the 27 names she didn't know yet, about the 6 years of a smaller life in Harlow, Oregon, and whether that life had been entirely about hiding or whether some part of it had been, without her fully knowing it, about waiting for the moment when hiding was no longer the most useful thing she could do. "Give it to the investigators," she said. "All of it." She reached forward and closed the laptop. The conference room was quiet. Foss was writing. Cahill was on the phone in the corner. Sarah stood at the end of the table and felt the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical depletion alone, but from the sustained effort of existing at a pitch higher than ordinary life requires. The attention, the assessment, the constant reading of the room that she'd been doing since the moment the German Shepherd stepped aside for her in the trauma bay. She'd been awake for 27 hours. She was about to start counting the ways her body was registering that fact. "Go home," Foss said, without looking up from her writing. "We have everything we need for the next several hours. You'll be called when the next stage is ready." Sarah went home. She slept for 9 hours in the particular collapsed way of a body that has been given permission to stop. When she woke, it was dark outside and she lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of her neighborhood. A car passing, someone's television through the wall. The ordinary texture of a world that had continued without drama while she was unconscious. And she thought about what came next with the specific clarity that sometimes arrives when the mind has been fully offline and comes back with a slightly different resolution. What came next was a medical evaluation. It was testimony in a federal proceeding. It was the reopening of a file that had been sealed for 6 years and the removal of a non-disclosure that had been the shape of her silence for as long as she could remember. What came next was her name attached to something. She wasn't afraid of it. That was the thing she noticed, lying there in the dark. For 6 years, the prospect of her name being attached to any of this had carried a weight she'd described to herself as fear, and she'd built her entire life around the avoidance of it. Lying there now, on the other side of the night she'd just come through, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like something that had been very heavy and had been set down. She got up, made coffee, sat at her kitchen table and read, on her phone, the first news alert that had come through at 4 in the afternoon. Federal investigators arrest 2 in connection with alleged military medical fraud. Vandermeer Defense Solutions contract suspended pending review. By the time she'd finished the coffee, there were 11 more alerts. By midnight, there were 47. The name Vandermeer was in every one of them. Noom's name, Wick's name, the suspended contract, the $800 million figure which journalists had clearly found as useful as she'd expected, the 43 hospital supply network, the pump access capability. Her name wasn't in any of them yet. That would come. She sat with her phone and read until the alert stopped surprising her, and then she set it down and looked at her kitchen and thought about whether she was hungry, which she was, and she ate toast and felt very ordinary, and understood that ordinary was not nothing, that ordinary was what you came back to when the pitch finally dropped, and that coming back to it was its own kind of proof that you'd survived. 3 days later, Ava Rourke woke up. Sarah was not there when it happened. She was on a scheduled shift. She'd gone back to work 48 hours after the night, because the alternative was sitting in her apartment waiting for things to happen to her rather than beside them, and she'd spent 6 years being good at her job and she was not going to stop. Deanna had looked at her when she walked through the door that first morning, back with an expression that said she was aware something significant had happened and had decided that the right response was to say nothing and hand her the chart for Bay 2. Sarah had taken the chart. She was on the post-surgical floor on a Tuesday afternoon when Cahill called to tell her that Rourke was conscious and asking to see her. She finished the medication round she was on. She had 3 patients in sequence, and she was not going to shortchange any of them because she had somewhere to be. And then she changed out of the floor gown she'd put on for an isolation room and walked to the neurology floor. Rourke's room looked different in the afternoon light, less like a crime scene and more like a hospital room, which it was. A woman in a bed with monitoring equipment and an IV line and a neurology fellow's notes on the whiteboard. Dax was on the floor beside the bed in the specific posture of a working dog who is technically resting but hasn't stopped working. He lifted his head when Sarah came through the door. Rourke was watching the door when she opened it. She was pale and looked like someone who had been through several consecutive near-death experiences in the space of a single night, which she had. Her left eye still showed bruising from the accident. She was thinner through the face than the photograph Sarah had looked at in the consultation room 11 days ago. She looked like someone who was very much alive and was aware of the specific value of that. "Nurse Ilan," she said. Her voice was rough from the tube the intubation team had placed during one of the critical windows. "I'm told you're the reason Dax was able to do his job." "Dax was doing his job before I got anywhere near the situation. That's how he works." Rourke looked at the dog. Something moved across her face. The particular expression of a person who understands that an animal has done something that exceeded what any person could have done and doesn't know quite how to account for it within ordinary language. "He picked you." "He cleared a path," Sarah said. "I walked through it." "That's what I said." Rourke looked at her steadily. There was an intelligence in her gaze that the hospital bed didn't diminish. The specific alertness of someone who had been moving toward a target for 14 months and had not stopped moving toward it just because her body was currently horizontal. "Cahill told me what you gave in testimony. The full statement." "Yes." "He told me about your record, about the non-disclosure." "Yes." "I've had your incident reports in my case file for 8 months, Rourke said. "The copies that were pulled before the originals were destroyed. I've read them 4 times. I know what you saw and what you tried to do." She paused. "I know what it cost." Sarah stood at the side of the bed and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would be more accurate than the silence. "Daniel Ware," Rourke said. "He was from Spokane. Grew up on the east side. He wanted to be a paramedic after his service." She said it quietly, not as performance, as information, as the specific act of giving someone their name back in full. "I have files on all 27. I can give you the names whenever you want them." "I want them," Sarah said. "I know." Rourke looked at her a moment longer. "What are you going to do after all of this?" Sarah thought about it. Not the diplomatic version of the answer. The real one. "Stay at Cascade Valley for now. Give the testimony when it's called for. Get the medical evaluation on the exposure and deal with whatever that produces." She paused. "I spent 6 years making myself small enough to fit inside a life that didn't require me to know what I knew. I'm done with that." "What does that look like?" "I'm still working that out." She said it honestly. "I have a meeting next week with the Army Medical Review Board. They want to formally re-examine my separation. There's a process for that." There is, Rourke said. I know someone who's good at navigating it. I'll send you a name. I don't need. I know you don't need it. I'm giving it anyway. The first trace of something like dry humor crossed Rourke's face. Let people give you things occasionally, Sergeant. It won't kill you. Sarah almost laughed. It came out as a breath that was adjacent to a laugh, which was probably more accurate. Noted. She stayed another 20 minutes. They didn't talk the whole time. There were stretches of comfortable quiet that had the quality of two people who had been through the same thing from different angles and could sit in the knowledge of that without needing to narrate it. Dax moved to sit beside Sarah at some point, leaning his weight against her leg with the specific trust of a dog that had decided she was part of the perimeter. She put her hand on his head. He leaned into it. When she left, Rourke said, "Thank you." Sarah nodded. Didn't say you're welcome because the formality of that felt wrong. Said instead, "Take care of yourself. Let the neurology team do their job." You sound like Cahill. Cahill's right. She walked back to the post-surgical floor and finished her shift. 6 weeks later, Garrett Sullins was formally charged with 11 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States, negligent homicide in the cases of 7 soldiers whose deaths he had directly overseen, and destruction of federal medical records. The charges were unsealed on a Wednesday morning, and the press release went out before noon. Aldrich Noom was charged the same day with attempted murder. 2 counts, for Rourke and for the additional attempt via the pump protocol, and conspiracy charges connected to the broader Vandermeer operation. Brennan Wick took a plea agreement and provided testimony that added 3 names to the list of Vandermeer employees who had known about the compound's effects and chosen to continue. The 2 Surgeon General's office representatives named in Sullins' original safety review were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Their names were in the indictment. Their signatures were in the public record. The Vandermeer Defense Solutions contract was not merely suspended. It was voided and referred for a full audit of every contract the company had held with the federal government for the preceding 7 years. The 43 hospital supply agreement was terminated, and a congressional subcommittee announced an investigation into the remote access capabilities that had been embedded in the Vandermeer-supplied pump network. Sarah read most of this on her phone on her breaks, in the same break room where she'd looked at the access log on the night that started everything. She read it with the specific quality of attention she brought to things that mattered, not casually, not skimming, but fully present, because these were the 27 names, and they deserved that. The Army Medical Review Board met formally 5 weeks after her testimony was submitted. The session lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, her discharge status was formally reclassified, the non-disclosure was vacated, and the sealed portion of her record was reopened and corrected. The correction was a 3-page document that said, in institutional language, that the administrative separation of Sergeant Sarah Elan had been improperly obtained and was based on a process that had itself been part of the criminal conduct under investigation. They mailed her a copy. She read it at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, and she thought about 22-year-old Daniel Ware from Spokane, who had wanted to be a paramedic. And she thought about the 26 other names she now knew, and she thought about what it meant that the correction existed on paper and would exist in a file somewhere forever. And she decided that it meant something, even if it didn't mean everything, and that something was worth having. She pinned the document to the corkboard above her desk. Not to display it, just to have it in a place where she could see it was real. Vail found out about the reclassification the same day the board's decision was reported in the state medical news. He came to the nurses' station where Sarah was updating charts. She was on days now, a schedule change she'd requested and that Deanna had approved without discussion, and stood beside her terminal for a moment in the way he had on the night after the first formal questioning when he'd needed to say something and was working out how. The review board decision, he said. Yes. Congratulations isn't the right word. No, she agreed. I don't know what the right word is. Neither do I. She kept typing. I'm not sure there is one. He was quiet. Then, I've been rethinking some things about how I run the trauma bay, how I use my team, how I listen. He said it with the specific difficulty of a person who is making an admission that touches something structural and not superficial. I've been talking to the nursing staff about it, not formally, just talking. She stopped typing, looked at him. What are they saying? He gave her a brief, slightly rueful look. that there's a lot of room for improvement. That's a generous summary. I know. He put his hands in his pockets. I'm working on it. He paused. You're a good nurse. You've always been a good nurse. I should have said that in a way that meant something earlier than now. It was not a perfect apology. It had edges and gaps, and it arrived 6 years late, and it did not resolve the larger question of how many times, in how many trauma bays, a person with Sarah's knowledge and training had been told to step back by someone who'd looked at the credential and not the competence. It did not fix that. One conversation in one hospital couldn't, but it was real, and it came from a man who wasn't in the habit of it, and Sarah understood that the difficulty of a thing and its value were sometimes directly proportional. Thank you, she said. He nodded, walked away. She went back to the charts. The exposure evaluation came back in the 7th week. A team from the Army Medical Research Facility had been assigned to her case following the review board decision, and they ran a comprehensive panel: cardiovascular, neurological, the specific markers associated with long-term exposure to the compound at the concentration Sullins documentation indicated. Sarah sat across from the evaluating physician, a thorough woman named Dr. Anise Pratt, who had clearly read every page of the file before the appointment and received the results with the particular stillness of someone who has spent several weeks preparing for news that could go several ways. The results were not clean. Some of the markers showed minor irregularities, consistent with low-level exposure over an extended period, Dr. Pratt said, using the careful language of a clinician who understood that careful language was not evasion but precision. The cardiac arrhythmia that Sarah had attributed to caffeine and shift work was real and warranted monitoring. The neurological panel was largely within normal range with 2 markers that required a follow-up in 6 months. It was not a death sentence, it was not nothing. You'll need quarterly monitoring for the foreseeable future, Pratt said. Certain environmental and pharmaceutical interactions should be avoided. I'm going to refer you to a cardiologist. She paused. The good news is that the exposure level was below the threshold that produced acute events in the trial subjects. The duration was significant, but the concentration was lower than the doses administered in the documented cases. Because I was handling the medications rather than receiving them, Sarah said. Yes. Handler exposure versus patient exposure, different profile. Pratt looked at her over the desk. You caught it. You caught it the night you were in that trauma bay, and you made sure it was investigated. The monitoring starts now because of what you did. That matters clinically. Sarah sat with that for a moment. The specific irony of it, that the training she'd been given to administer the compound was also the training that had allowed her to recognize it, 6 years later, in a compromised IV line in the middle of the night. That the thing that had been done to her had also given her the knowledge to undo what was being done to someone else. She was not going to call that justice. It was too complicated to call that. It was just the way things had landed, in the imperfect and non-cinematic way that real sequences of events landed. Not resolved, not tidy, but moved forward. Different from where they'd been. She made the cardiology appointment. She scheduled the 6-month neurological follow-up. She filled out the monitoring paperwork and took it home in a manila envelope and put it in the filing cabinet next to the corkboard where the review board decision was pinned. Then she went back to work. It was a Thursday in October when Ava Rourke was discharged from Cascade Valley Medical Center. Sarah heard about it from Deanna, who had heard from the neurology floor charge nurse, who had mentioned it because the entire floor apparently knew at this point that the patient in 412 was connected to the nurse on the post-surgical floor who had done the thing that everyone in the building was still processing in their own way, and mostly not talking about directly. Sarah was doing a medication round when Rourke appeared in the corridor of the post-surgical floor. She was ambulatory, more than ambulatory actually, with the specific quality of movement of someone whose body had been through significant damage and had come back from it slightly changed in posture, slightly slower, but entirely present. Dax walked beside her with his nose near her left hand. She was wearing civilian clothes and carrying a jacket, and she looked from the end of the corridor like someone's visitor rather than a patient, which was the point. Sarah finished the medication check she was on. She was not going to shortchange the patient in 408 because Ava Rourke was standing in the hallway, and capped the syringe and logged the administration and then walked out to the corridor. They looked at each other. You didn't have to come up, Sarah said. I know. Rourke looked at her with the direct gaze she'd had in the hospital room, the particular attention of someone who was very good at reading people and had been reading Sarah for the duration of her stay, and had arrived at conclusions she was comfortable with. "The names," she said. "I have them. All 27. I can send the files to whatever address you want. My personal email." "Done." She reached into the jacket she was carrying and produced a card. "And this is the name I mentioned, the person who navigates the review board process. He's good. Not cheap, but the Army has a victims' counsel provision that covers his rate in cases like yours, so it won't cost you." She held the card out. Sarah took it. "What's next for you?" she asked. Rourke thought about it with the brief pause of someone who actually considers the question rather than defaulting to the prepared answer. "Congressional testimony, probably 3 separate committees. Then a book, eventually. Not the kind I write, but someone will, and they'll need access. And I want to make sure it's accurate." She paused. "And sleep. A lot of sleep. Apparently my neurology team has opinions about sleep." "They're right. You sound like Cahill. You mentioned that before." "It keeps being true." Rourke looked at her steadily. "What about you?" Sarah thought about the question with the same honesty she'd brought to it the first time. The answer was clearer now than it had been 3 weeks ago, not because the future was more certain, but because she'd stopped trying to make it fit into the shape of the smaller life she'd been living. "I'm going to apply for the Trauma Nursing Specialist certification," she said. "There's a program at the Regional Medical Center. It's 18 months, part-time clinical, part-time academic." She paused. "And I've been contacted by the Army Medical Review Board about a consulting role, reviewing field medical protocols, looking at where the oversight systems fail." She let that land for a moment. "I'm going to think about it." "Think about it seriously," Rourke said. "I am." Dax moved from Rourke's side and pushed his nose briefly against Sarah's hand. Not demanding, not asking, just contact. The specific acknowledgement of an animal that had worked alongside her through something difficult and was noting, in its wordless way, that the work was done and the standing was still mutual. She put her hand on his head, the way she had in the hospital room, and he leaned into it, and then he moved back to Rourke's side because that was where he belonged, and he knew it. "You're going to be fine," Rourke said, not as a comfort, as a statement of assessed fact from someone who was good at assessing. "I know," Sarah said. It was true. Not in the clean, uncomplicated way that it would be in a story that resolved neatly. Her health monitoring was ongoing, her career was mid-reconstruction, the federal proceedings would require her presence and her testimony for months. But true in the foundational sense of a person who has located themselves accurately in their own life and understands what they're standing on. Rourke nodded once, walked down the corridor toward the elevator. Dax kept pace at her left side without looking back. Sarah watched them go. Then she turned and walked back to the medication cart because she had 3 more patients on the round, and the morning didn't stop for the moments that deserved more time than they got. She pushed the cart down the hall, checked the chart on 410, knocked before she entered. The patient inside, a 63-year-old man recovering from a knee replacement, irritable and bored in the way of patients who feel well enough to be unhappy about still being in the hospital, looked up when she came in. Finally, he said. "Good morning," she said. "Let's see how your night went." She was, as she had always been, a nurse. She'd never stopped being one, not when she was a combat medic in a landscape that burned in summer, not when she was signing papers in a room where the walls felt like they were closing, not during 6 years of choosing invisibility over the alternative. She'd been a nurse through all of it. The title had felt like a diminishment only to people who used it that way, and what she understood now, not newly, but with the specific clarity of something confirmed, was that it had never diminished anything. It had just been where the work was. She checked the patient's vitals, adjusted the drainage, noted the improvement in his mobility scores from the night team's log. She answered his grumpy questions about discharge timing with the patience of someone who understood that grumpiness was often just anxiety with a less vulnerable costume. When she came out of the room, Deanna was at the nurse's station, looking at her with an expression Sarah had catalogued over 6 years and knew as the look that preceded something Deanna had been working up to saying. "The CMO's office called," Deanna said. "They want you for the hospital's patient safety committee, the one that's doing the protocol review on networked equipment." She paused. "Apparently your name came up at the board level." Sarah stopped. In what context? In the context of someone who would know what to look for. Deanna's expression was carefully neutral, which meant she had opinions and had decided to let Sarah form her own. It's a voluntary appointment, monthly meetings. You'd be the only bedside nurse on the committee. Rest are attendings and administrators. That's a problem, Sarah said. That's what I told them. Deanna paused. I suggested they add a second bedside nurse and let you help identify who. They said yes. She handed Sarah a printed email with the committee chair's contact information. Think about it. Sarah folded the email and put it in her pocket. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Tell them yes. Deanna's careful neutrality became a small, satisfied nod. I already told them you'd say that. Sarah pushed the medication cart back to the supply room and locked it, and washed her hands and looked at herself briefly in the supply room mirror. The face of a woman who had been awake for 27 hours 3 months ago and was now standing in a hospital corridor in the morning light, tired in the ordinary way rather than the extraordinary one, with a full shift ahead of her and 3 things on her to-do list that hadn't existed 3 months ago. Medical monitoring, certification program, safety committee, and 27 names she was going to learn by heart. She turned off the supply room light and walked back to the nurse's station to pull her next chart, because the floor didn't stop and the patients didn't wait, and she had work to do. The same work she'd always done, in the same building, with the same hands, except that nothing about it was the same as it had been before the night a German shepherd stepped aside in a trauma bay and let her through. She had been dismissed, and she had been buried, and she had been told, in 100 different registers over a span of years, that the lane she was in was smaller than the one she deserved. She hadn't argued. She'd done the job. She'd kept her eyes on the secondary line and her hands clean and her knowledge intact. And when the moment came that required everything she knew, she'd been standing exactly where she needed to be. Not because the story had arranged itself for her, because she had stayed. That was the thing nobody told you about quiet strength, that it wasn't passive, wasn't resignation, wasn't the absence of something larger. It was the decision to remain competent in the darkness, to keep the knowledge alive when there was no immediate use for it, to be present and prepared for the moment that might never come, but did. It was the long discipline of a person who refuses to become less than they are just because the room they're standing in won't accommodate the full size of them. Sarah Elan pulled her next chart, read it carefully, knocked on the door of 411.